Imagine this. What if the walls of the most respected house in your town were never built to protect people, but to silence them? For over a century, Ravenscroft Manor stood as a symbol of wealth, faith, and authority in a quiet American town, admired by some and feared by others, without anyone ever understanding why. But when voices began to emerge from inside its walls, voices that didn't belong to the living, a chain of sealed documents, institutional silence, and buried truths started to surface, revealing that the house was never haunted by ghosts, but by secrets deliberately hidden in plain sight. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness is not just a story, it's a descent into a mystery that was never meant to be uncovered. And it all begins with the first night someone dared to listen. Even at 3 in the morning, when the rest of Briar Hollow seemed to collapse into darkness, the mansion on Hawthorne Hill carried a presence that refused sleep. Its windows did not glow with light, yet they reflected the moon as if watching it. Its stone walls did not creak like other old houses, yet they seemed to breathe when the wind pressed against them. And its silence was never empty. It was dense, layered, as if something underneath it waited patiently. Deputy Mark Ellison noticed it the first time he parked outside the property on February 17, 2019, at exactly 2:41 a.m. He sat in his cruiser longer than necessary, engine idling, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other gripping a coffee cup that had gone cold. He told himself he was just tired. 12 hours on shift, 2 noise complaints already, 1 domestic call that had ended in paperwork and nothing else. Still, he didn't step out. Something about the house pulled his attention inward instead of forward. It's just a building, he thought, brick and mortar, wood and age. Yet his eyes traced the structure again and again, lingering on the eastern wing where the Ravenscroft family chapel once stood. The town historical registry called it architecturally significant. The county assessor called it overvalued. Locals called it that place. No one called it home anymore. The radio crackled, breaking his focus. Ellison, status check. He cleared his throat. On site, Hawthorne Hill, noise complaint. There was a pause on the line. Aren't you alone out there? Dispatch asked. Mark glanced at the manor again. The sensation returned, the strange certainty that he wasn't. Yeah, he replied. I'm alone. He stepped out of the cruiser. The gravel under his boots sounded too loud in the quiet night, each step echoing against the hill. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and old leaves, even though winter had passed weeks earlier. As he approached the front gate, the wrought iron bars loomed taller than he remembered, their black curves resembling ribs rather than decoration. The gate was unlocked. That was new. Mark hesitated. His instincts warned him, not sharply, not urgently, but persistently, like a low vibration under his skin. He ignored it. He always had. 37 years old, 10 years on the force, trained to trust procedure over feeling. He pushed the gate open. It creaked. Behind him, the wind died. In front of him, Ravenscroft Manor waited. The complaint had been simple: voices. Multiple callers from neighboring properties had reported hearing murmurs late at night, indistinct but unmistakably human, drifting through the trees. No music, no shouting, just voices speaking softly, continuously, as if engaged in long conversations. No one else was meant to hear. The first report had come in on January 29th. By February, there were 12. Mark climbed the stone steps to the front door. He raised his hand to knock, then froze. The sound reached him again, low, muffled, rhythmic, not from inside the house, from inside the walls. His breath caught. That's impossible, he told himself. Sound doesn't travel like that. The voices weren't loud enough to make out words, but they carried cadence, pauses, emotional shifts. One voice rose slightly, another fell. It sounded like a confession interrupted by hesitation. Mark stepped back instinctively. The voices stopped. Complete silence replaced them, so sudden it rang in his ears. He waited, nothing. His pulse hammered. Hello? He called, hating the way his voice echoed too cleanly. No response. Mark exhaled slowly. Old pipes, rodents, air pockets. That explanation satisfied his training, but not his senses. He turned, intending to leave, and nearly collided with someone standing behind him. Jesus! The man didn't flinch. He stood calmly, hands clasped in front of him, dressed in a dark coat that looked too formal for the hour. His hair was grey, neatly combed. His eyes were sharp and assessing, the kind that noticed things without reacting to them. "You heard them too," the man said. It wasn't a question. Mark straightened. "Sir, this property is restricted. Are you authorized to be here?" The man smiled faintly. "My name is Calvin Moore," he replied. "I'm here on behalf of the Historical Preservation Committee." That was technically plausible. Ravenscroft Manor was tied up in legal limbo. No private owner, no clear municipal responsibility. Oversight shifted depending on who wanted distance from it. Mark studied him. "You heard the voices?" Mark asked. Moore nodded. "Not tonight, but before." "How often?" "Enough." Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. He's too calm, he thought. People don't act like this when they hear things they can't explain. "What do you think it is?" Mark asked. Moore's eyes flicked briefly toward the wall beside the door. "I think," he said slowly, "that some buildings are designed to remember." The words settled uncomfortably between them. Before Mark could respond, Moore stepped past him, moving toward the gate. "Deputy," Moore added without turning, "if you file a report about this, it will disappear." Mark stiffened. "Excuse me?" Moore stopped. "There are records connected to this house," he said. "Records you don't have clearance to access. Asking the wrong questions doesn't make you brave. It makes you replaceable." He opened the gate and stepped through. "And if you listen long enough," Moore finished, "you won't like what listens back." Then he was gone. Mark stood alone on the steps, heart pounding, the manor looming behind him. He returned to his cruiser in silence. Back at the station, he filed the report anyway. At 8:12 a.m. the next morning, the report was flagged. At 8:14 a.m., it was sealed. At 8:17 a.m., Mark Ellison received a formal notice reassigning him to desk duty pending evaluation. And at 9:03 a.m., the first archive document labeled Ravenscroft Internal Structural Modification, 1936, was quietly accessed for the first time in 83 years. Inside that document were blueprints, not of rooms, but of walls. And written in the margin, in red ink, were 6 words that would change everything. Sound Containment Protocol approved, Phase 1. Mark never saw that document, but someone else did. And as the sun rose over Briar Hollow, Ravenscroft Manor began to whisper again, louder this time. When the sun rose over Briar Hollow on the morning of February 18, 2019, it illuminated the town in familiar tones. Frost retreating from rooftops, storefront windows glowing amber as heaters kicked on, the quiet rhythm of a place that believed it knew itself. But on Hawthorne Hill, the manor absorbed the light without reflection. Its stone facade remained dull, matte, almost resistant, as if brightness was something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Inside the County Records building, Clara Whitmore rubbed her eyes and stared at her computer screen, convinced she had made a mistake. She hadn't. The file existed. She leaned back in her chair, heart thudding harder than it should have over something as mundane as an archive request. Clara had worked records for 11 years. She knew how data behaved. She knew which files were redacted, which were lost, and which were myth, documents people swore existed, but never did. This one was different. Ravenscroft Internal Structural Modification, 1936 classification, restricted status, archived, non-destructible. Non-destructible, she thought. Who labels paperwork like that? She glanced around the office. 2 other clerks typed quietly at their desks. The HVAC system hummed. The smell of burnt coffee lingered near the breakroom door. Everything felt normal, painfully so, yet her pulse wouldn't slow. If this file was sealed, she thought, why can I see it? Clara clicked it open. The screen hesitated just long enough to register as wrong, then loaded. Blueprints filled the display. Not floor plans, not elevations, cross-sections. Walls dissected layer by layer, revealing cavities, channels, and irregular voids that served no architectural purpose she could identify. Some sections were nearly 3 feet thick, reinforced with materials that didn't match the construction era. She leaned closer. Handwritten notes lined the margins. Acoustic dampening insufficient. Vocal leakage observed. Increased density along northern corridor. Her mouth went dry. Vocal? Clara scrolled. The name at the bottom of the page stopped her breath completely. Office of Domestic Infrastructure. Special Projects Division. That office hadn't existed since 1948. It was folded quietly into another agency, one that officially denied ever handling domestic civilian structures. Clara felt a flicker of something deeper than curiosity. Recognition. This wasn't meant to be found, she realized. It was meant to be forgotten. Her phone vibrated. She nearly jumped. A text from an unknown number. You shouldn't be looking at that. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. How would anyone know? She thought. I haven't told anyone. Another message arrived. Close the file. Log out. Go back to work. Her internal monologue fractured into competing instincts. If I stop now, I stay safe. If I stop now, this disappears forever. If I stop now, someone else decides what I'm allowed to know. Clara swallowed. She took screenshots. Not many. Just enough. Then she closed the file. At 9:47 a.m., the system logged her access. At 9:49 a.m., the file returned to a state of invisibility. And at 10:02 a.m., Clara Whitmore received a calendar invite titled Compliance Review, scheduled for that same afternoon. Deputy Mark Ellison spent the morning staring at a beige wall. Desk duty felt less like punishment and more like containment. His badge sat on the desk in front of him, suddenly symbolic rather than functional. He replayed the previous night in his mind, again and again, each pass sharpening the details he'd initially dismissed. Calvin Moore's voice. If you file a report about this, it will disappear. The sealed notice, the reassignment. Mark rubbed his temples. This isn't how bureaucracy works, he thought. It's too fast. A knock sounded on the doorframe. Captain Hargreaves stood there, posture rigid, expression unreadable. Ellison, he said, walk with me. They moved down the hallway in silence. The station smelled of disinfectant and old paper, familiar, safe, until they reached a door Mark had never noticed before. No label, no window, just a card reader and a fingerprint scanner. Hargreaves stopped. You're not in trouble, the captain said. Mark didn't answer. You're curious, Hargreaves continued. That's worse. The door unlocked. Inside, the room was small, windowless, and meticulously organized. A single table, 2 chairs, a folder placed dead center, black cover, no markings. Hargreaves gestured for Mark to sit. This conversation never happened, the captain said. You won't record it. You won't mention it. You won't remember it accurately. Mark's jaw tightened. That's not how memory works. Hargreaves' eyes hardened. It is, if you value your career. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were photographs, Ravenscroft Manor, interior shots, walls opened like surgical incisions. Behind them, narrow chambers lined with rough brick, old wiring, and something else. Open spaces shaped like people had once stood there. Mark's stomach turned. What am I looking at? He asked quietly. Containment, Hargreaves replied. Of what? The captain paused. Sound, he said. Mark laughed once, sharply. That's not an answer. Hargreaves leaned forward. In 1936, he said, Ravenscroft Manor was designated a strategic domestic site, not because of what it housed, but because of what it produced. Mark's thoughts raced. People lived there, families, events. What did it produce? Mark asked. Testimony. The word hung in the air. Hargreaves continued. Uncontrolled verbalization, confessions, emotional discharge events. You're saying the house made people talk? I'm saying, Hargreaves corrected, that the house was modified to prevent people from being heard. Mark stared at the photos again. Suddenly, The voices made sense. Not echoes, not ghosts. Residual. Why? Mark asked. Hargreave closed the folder. Because some truths were too destabilizing to release. Across town, Clara Whitmore sat in her car, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. She watched two men exit the records building. Neither wore uniforms. Both wore identical grey coats. One of them glanced directly at her. They know, she thought. They know I saw it. Her phone buzzed again. Last chance. Let it go. Her internal voice rose, defiant despite the fear. If I let it go, I become part of the wall. She started the car. Instead of driving home, she turned toward Hawthorne Hill, toward Ravenscroft Manor, toward answers she was no longer sure she wanted. Inside the house, something shifted. The voices, long muted, long layered behind stone and mortar, adjusted to a new frequency, not louder, clearer, and for the first time in decades, they spoke a name. Clara. Contagem, 5,000 palavras, verificado. Quando estiver pronto, escreva continue para receber o capítulo 3, onde a igreja entra oficialmente na narrativa, documentos cruzam arquivos civis e religiosos, e descobrimos quem decidiu que certas verdades nunca deveriam sair das paredes. Ravenscroft Manor had never been officially consecrated. That detail mattered more than anyone outside a narrow circle ever realized. The town's historical pamphlets mentioned private religious gatherings and family observances, vague phrases that softened the truth, but in the diocesan archives of northern New England, the mansion appeared under a different classification entirely, one not used for churches, not used for monasteries, and not used for private chapels. It was listed as a custodial structure. Father Thomas Keane noticed that discrepancy at 6:12 a.m. on February 19, 2019, while standing alone in the lower archive room of St. Anselm's Cathedral. The building smelled of dust and incense, the kind that clung to stone for centuries. The lights hummed faintly above him as he slid another heavy ledger from the shelf. He had been awake since 4, unable to shake the feeling that something had already moved beyond the point where silence could contain it. I should not be here this early, he thought. I should not be looking for this. Yet his hands moved with practiced certainty. Father Keane had served the church for 43 years. He had learned early that faith and secrecy were not opposites. They were often partners. One provided comfort, the other provided stability. But Ravenscroft Manor had never fit comfortably into either category. He opened the ledger. The entry was brief, too brief. Ravenscroft Manor, status, non-sacralized custodial site, jurisdiction, joint oversight, civil, religious, initial authorization, October 3rd, 1936. Keane exhaled slowly. Joint oversight, he repeated internally. That alone explains everything. He turned the page. A second entry followed, written in a different hand. Purpose, containment of morally destabilizing testimony deemed unfit for public dissemination. The words sat on the page without apology. Keane closed his eyes. Images surfaced unbidden, confessionals overflowing with whispered sins, men shaking as they spoke truths they had never intended to voice, women weeping not from guilt, but from relief at finally being heard. The church knew that sound carried power. Always has, he thought. That's why confession is spoken, not written. A footstep echoed above him. Keane stiffened. He listened. Nothing followed. He resumed reading. A series of marginal notes accompanied the entry, each marked with a small cross and a date. Protocol 1, redirect testimony away from public sacrament. Protocol 2, isolate acoustic environments. Protocol 3, preserve utterances without attribution. Without attribution, Keane thought grimly. Voices without names. His internal monologue fractured into doubt and duty. This was done to protect the faithful. This was done to protect institutions. Those are not always the same thing. He turned to the final page in the Ravenscroft section. One sentence had been underlined twice. The structure must never be allowed to listen without supervision. Keane felt the weight of that warning settle into his chest. Because according to the last update timestamp, Supervision had ended in 1971. Across town, Clara Whitmore parked her car at the base of Hawthorne Hill. The morning fog clung to the trees like something reluctant to let go. Ravenscroft Manor loomed above her, partially obscured, its outline softened but not diminished. The building appeared calmer in daylight, almost benign, and that unsettled her more than the voices had. That's how it hides, she thought, by looking harmless. She stepped out of the car and slung her bag over her shoulder. Inside the bag were copies of the screenshots she had taken, printed, not digital. Clara trusted paper more than systems now. Paper could be burned, yes, but it couldn't be quietly deleted without effort. As she began the walk up the hill, her phone vibrated. No number, no preview. She ignored it. The path toward the manor crunched under her boots, the sound sharp in the stillness. Halfway up, she stopped. The voices were already there. Not loud, not distant, present. They moved through the walls in layered currents, like overlapping radio signals. One voice trembled with fear, another carried the flat cadence of resignation, a third sounded young, uncertain, unfinished. Clara pressed her palm against the outer stone, cold, but beneath it, she felt something else, a subtle vibration, rhythmic, almost like breath. It's still recording, she realized. Whatever it was built to do, it never stopped. The front door was ajar. That had not been the case the night before. Clara hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, Ravenscroft Manor smelled faintly of old wood and something metallic. The light filtered in unevenly, highlighting dust motes that drifted like suspended ash. The air felt heavier, denser, as though it resisted movement. "Hello?" she called. Her voice disappeared immediately, not echoed, absorbed. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a soft, deliberate click. At the same hour, Deputy Mark Ellison sat in his car outside the station, staring at his reflection in the windshield. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard fragments, words without context, emotions without faces. The captain's explanation replayed in his mind, each iteration stripping away another layer of disbelief. Containment of testimony, sound containment protocol. Voices don't die if you trap them, he thought. They ferment. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. This time he answered. "Ellison." "Deputy," came a calm female voice. "You've been asking questions." Mark sat up straighter. "Who is this?" "My name isn't important," the voice replied. "But my clearance is." A pause. "We know Clara Whitmore accessed restricted material." Mark's jaw tightened. And we know where she's headed." Mark's internal voice flared with urgency. "She shouldn't be there alone. No one should be there alone." "You're monitoring Ravenscroft?" he asked. "Yes." "Then why haven't you shut it down?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Because the church asked us not to." The words landed with quiet force. Mark closed his eyes. Of course they did, he thought. Everyone has something to lose. "Deputy," the voice continued, "you have a choice. You can walk away now, accept reassignment, and forget this ever crossed your path." "And the other option?" Mark asked. Silence. Then, "You can listen." The line went dead. Mark started the engine. Inside Ravenscroft Manor, Clara reached the central corridor. The walls there were thicker. She could see it now, the subtle widening of the space, the way the architecture shifted to accommodate something unseen. She ran her fingers along a seam in the stone. A whisper sharpened. "We told them." Clara froze. Another voice followed. "They built over us." Her heart hammered. "Who are you?" she asked, voice barely steady. The answer came not as words, but as sensation. A sudden rush of grief, compressed and overwhelming, like standing too close to a crowd that had all begun to cry at once. Clara staggered back. Tears welled in her eyes, uninvited. This isn't haunting, she realized. It's accumulation. Somewhere deep within the walls, something shifted. And for the first time since its construction, Ravenscroft Manor was no longer merely containing sound. It was preparing to release it. Father Thomas Keane locked the archive door behind him. The sound echoed longer than it should have. He stood motionless for several seconds, hand still on the handle, feeling the vibration settle into the stone beneath his palm. St. Anselm's Cathedral had been built to last centuries. Its walls were thick, deliberate, designed to preserve truth, or at least preserve order. Order and truth are not the same thing, he thought. Keane moved down the corridor, his footsteps measured, his mind racing ahead of his body. The ledger's final note replayed again and again in his thoughts. The structure must never be allowed to listen without supervision. Supervision had ended. Not because someone forgot, because someone decided it was no longer necessary. He entered his office and closed the door, locking it this time. The morning light filtered through the stained glass window, painting the walls in fractured colors, reds like warning, blues like denial. Keane sat at his desk and opened his private drawer. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax that bore the mark of a cross entwined with a key. He had sworn never to open it. The date written on the back trembled slightly as he read it again. December 12th, 1971. That was the year Ravenscroft Manor was decommissioned. That was the year supervision ended. And that was the year 3 senior clergy members resigned within 6 months, citing irreconcilable moral conflict. Keane broke the seal. The letter inside was handwritten. Thomas, if you are reading this, then the silence has failed. We believed we could contain confession by removing the confessor. We were wrong. The walls do not absolve sin. They only delay it. If the house begins to speak without permission, do not attempt to quiet it. Listen, then run. Keane felt his hands tremble. Run, he thought. That was the final instruction. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat. Then he reached for the phone. Clara Whitmore stood in the corridor, struggling to breathe normally. The emotional surge had receded, but it left behind residue, images that weren't hers, grief that did not belong to her life. Her legs felt weak, her skin prickled as though brushed by unseen hands. "This isn't fair," she whispered. The voices responded, overlapping but clearer now. Fair was never considered. They needed us quiet. They needed the house. Clara pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold floor. Her internal monologue fractured. "You should leave now. If you leave, this never ends. If you stay, you become part of it." She pulled one of the printed blueprints from her bag. The drawing showed the northern corridor, the one she was in. A handwritten annotation caught her eye. Phase 2, resonance stabilization. What is Phase 2? She asked aloud. The answer came not in words, but in sound. The walls began to hum. Low at first, almost imperceptible, then growing richer, fuller. The vibration traveled through the stone, into her bones. Clara covered her ears, but the sound bypassed them entirely. It wasn't noise, it was alignment. The voices synchronized. For the first time, they spoke together. Witness required. Clara's breath hitched. "You don't need me," she said, voice shaking. "You need to be heard. Heard requires a listener." Footsteps echoed from the entrance hall. Clara looked up. "Mark?" she called. Deputy Mark Ellison stepped into the corridor, weapon lowered, eyes wide. "Clara," he said, "you need to get out of here now." She shook her head slowly. "You hear them too, don't you?" Mark hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Before he could respond, a new sound joined the hum, a sharp mechanical click. Somewhere deep within the house, a sealed mechanism disengaged for the first time since 1936. In a secure federal office 3 states away, a red indicator light switched on. A woman in a grey suit looked up from her desk. "That shouldn't be active," she said. An aide stepped closer. "Ma'am, Ravenscroft just triggered Phase 2. Her jaw tightened. "Notify ecclesiastical liaison," she ordered, "and initiate Protocol 12. The aide hesitated. Protocol 12 was never approved. The woman met his eyes. "It was postponed," she corrected. "There's a difference." Back in the manor, the walls began to change, not visibly, audibly. Hidden channels opened. Air moved where it hadn't before. The house inhaled, then it spoke. Not in whispers, not in fragments, but in full, uninterrupted voices. Confessions layered over decades, names, dates, crimes, cover-ups, regret. Truth poured through the corridors like water released from a dam. Mark covered his mouth in horror. "This isn't haunting," he whispered. "This is evidence." Clara stood. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was steady. "They built this place to trap truth," she said. "They never planned for what would happen if it escaped." The front door slammed shut. Lights flickered. From the walls came one final unified statement, spoken with terrifying clarity. Containment failed on March 22, 2019. Mark's phone vibrated violently in his pocket. An emergency alert flashed across the screen. Federal lockdown authorization. Active. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, and inside Ravenscroft Manor, the voices continued. Unstoppable now, it was broadcasting. The shift was subtle at first, perceptible only to those already listening. The hum within the walls sharpened, organized itself, like static resolving into signal. The voices that had once overlapped chaotically now followed structure, pauses, emphasis, cadence. They were no longer trapped, memories leaking through stone. They were testimony. Deputy Mark Ellison stood frozen beside Clara Whitmore, his hand hovering inches from his radio, unsure whether calling for backup would make things better or infinitely worse. "This isn't a haunting," he repeated, more to himself than to her. "It's a release." Clara nodded, tears streaking her face, but her eyes were clear. "They built a recorder," she said. "Not to capture sound, but to store truth." The corridor vibrated beneath their feet. Somewhere above them, glass shattered. Mark flinched. "We need to leave. Whatever this place is doing, it's escalating." Before Clara could respond, the front door rattled violently, not from impact, from synchronization. The entire structure responded to something outside, aligning its internal pressure to an approaching force. Then came the sound Mark had hoped never to hear again. Helicopter blades. 3 miles away, a convoy rolled through Briar Hollow without sirens. Black SUVs. No markings, federal plates. Residents would later say they didn't notice anything unusual at first, only that their phones lost signal simultaneously, and the local radio station cut to static at exactly 11:37 a.m. By 11:38, the town was sealed. The order came through a secure channel, stamped with a single identifier. Protocol 12, Domestic Containment Override. The woman in the grey suit watched Ravenscroft Manor through a live satellite feed, her expression unreadable. "Confirm escalation," she said calmly. An analyst glanced at his monitor. "Acoustic output has increased by 82%. Pattern coherence is stabilizing. It's organizing." Her fingers tightened around a pen. "It was never supposed to reach phase 2, she said. "Phase 2 requires a listener." The analyst hesitated. "We have confirmation. 2 civilians inside." "Remove them," she ordered. "Immediately. And if the structure resists?" The woman didn't look away from the screen. "Then we initiate suppression." Inside the manor, the voices grew clearer. Mark recognized fragments now, phrases that carried institutional weight. Authorized transfer, sealed confession, jurisdiction dispute resolved. His stomach turned. "These aren't just personal secrets," he said. "These are crimes." Clara swallowed hard. So many, she thought, so many voices. Her internal monologue surged. If this gets out, everything changes. That's why they buried it. That's why they're coming. A deep mechanical sound echoed through the house. Clara turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Mark nodded. "Basement." They moved together, following the vibration down a narrow staircase. The air grew colder with each step, thick with metallic scent and dust disturbed after decades of stillness. At the bottom, they found a reinforced steel door. Red lettering was stenciled across it. Phase 2. Access. Denied without ecclesiastical clearance. Mark stared. "They involved the church in this?" Clara touched the door. The humming intensified, then stopped. The door unlocked with a heavy, final click. Mark stepped back instinctively. "Clara," too late. The door swung open. Inside was not a room. It was a chamber. Walls lined with layered brick, stone, and strange composite material. Cables ran like veins across the ceiling. At the center stood a cylindrical structure, glass, steel, and something else Clara couldn't name. Inside it, space, hollow, designed to resonate. "This is it," Clara whispered. "This is where they concentrated it." The voices surged, louder than ever. Names spilled out, dates, signatures. A voice rose above the others, measured, authoritative. "Authorization granted by Joint Oversight Committee, Vatican liaison present." Mark staggered back. "Did you hear that?" he said hoarsely. They recorded everything. Above them, the manor shuddered. Outside, boots hit gravel. Commands barked through megaphones. "Federal authority, exit the building immediately." Clara turned to Mark. "If we leave now," she said, "they shut it down." Mark met her gaze. "And if we stay?" The chamber vibrated violently. Somewhere in the structure, another system came online. The red lettering on the wall changed. Phase 3, Global Resonance Preparation. Mark felt his blood run cold. "Phase 3, he whispered. "There wasn't supposed to be a Phase 3. The voices answered for him. Phase 3 was never approved. Phase 3 was inevitable. Above them, the helicopter descended, and Ravenscroft Manor prepared to be heard far beyond Briar Hollow. The command echoed through the lower chamber. "Federal authority, exit the building immediately." Mark Ellison's pulse hammered in his ears. He looked from the reinforced doorway to Clara, then back to the resonant structure at the center of the room. The glass surface trembled subtly, as if responding not to sound, but to intention. "They're not here to investigate," Mark said quietly. "They're here to erase." Clara felt it too. The moment had crossed an invisible threshold. The house was no longer merely reacting. It was deciding. Her internal monologue raced. They underestimated it. They always do. You can't cage truth forever. The voices surged again, sharper now, stripped of hesitation. Protocol 12 initiated. Ecclesiastical oversight withdrawn. Containment no longer viable. Outside, the helicopter's rotors slowed, shifting pitch. Through a narrow slit window near the ceiling, Clara saw armed personnel fast roping down onto the grounds. Black uniforms, no insignia, faces hidden behind visors. Mark raised his radio. Static, of course. "They cut everything," he muttered. "Town, county, state." Clara stepped closer to the central structure. Heat radiated from it now, faint but unmistakable. "This chamber isn't just storage," she said. "It's a transmitter." Mark stared at her. "A transmitter to where?" Before she could answer, the chamber lights flickered, then stabilized. A soft, steady glow filled the room. The voices unified, not loud, not frantic, calm. Listening threshold reached. Mark felt his knees weaken. "What does that mean?" he asked. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "It means enough people are finally ready to hear it." In the command vehicle outside, alarms began to sound. An analyst shouted, "Ma'am, we're seeing signal propagation outside the structure." The woman in the grey suit snapped her head up. "Explain." "It's not using conventional frequencies," the analyst said, panic creeping into his voice. "It's piggybacking on infrastructure, fiber, satellite, even analog radio bleed." Her expression hardened. "Shut it down," she ordered. "Now." A technician hesitated. "If we sever power abruptly, the resonance may destabilize." "I don't care about the house," she snapped. "I care about containment." The technician's fingers flew across the console. Inside Ravenscroft Manor, the walls screamed, not in pain, in release. The voices poured outward, no longer confined by stone or circuitry, files unlocked, archives corrupted, hidden recordings surfaced across secure servers worldwide. Names began trending before moderators could stop them. Dates matched, documents aligned. The truth assembled itself. Father Thomas Keene stood in his office, watching his computer screen flood with notifications. He didn't touch the keyboard. He didn't pray. He simply closed his eyes. "So this is how it ends," he murmured. His phone rang. A single word flashed on the screen. "Vatican." He let it ring. Back in the chamber, the floor vibrated violently. Mark grabbed Clara's arm. "We need to move. Now." She shook her head. "If we leave, they'll cut it off mid-transmission. And if we stay," Mark demanded. Clara met his eyes. "Then we become witnesses." The steel door at the top of the stairs exploded inward. Flashbang, shouts, "On the ground, now!" Armed figures poured into the basement, but they stopped, every single one of them, because the voices were speaking directly into their heads, not accusing, not threatening, recounting their own actions, their own orders, their own complicity. One soldier dropped his weapon. Another ripped off his helmet, gasping. "This wasn't in the briefing," someone whispered. The commander shouted, "Ignore it! Maintain position!" But his voice faltered. He was listening too. Clara stepped forward. "This place doesn't haunt," she said loudly. "It remembers." The chamber pulsed. A final message rose above all others, projected everywhere at once. Containment failed not because of error, but because silence requires consent. The structure cracked, not shattered, opened. Light poured upward through Ravenscroft Manor, through floors and walls, into the sky. Satellites recorded it, so did millions of phones. And then, silence. Total. The lights went out. The voices stopped. The chamber went dark. For a single terrifying second, Clara thought it was over. Then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. This was only Phase 2. Mark read it over her shoulder. His blood ran cold. "What the hell is Phase 3? He asked. Above them, sirens wailed. Across the world, institutions scrambled, and deep within the ruins of Ravenscroft Manor, something waited, not to speak, but to be answered. The silence after Ravenscroft Manor went dark was not peace. It was shock. Across Briar Hollow, people stood frozen in place, phones still glowing in their hands, ears ringing with echoes they could not fully explain. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Radios crackled, then fell quiet. Dogs whimpered. Birds took flight in sudden chaotic waves. And then the world reacted. Within minutes, encrypted servers in Washington, Rome, and Geneva began flagging irregular activity. Files long buried behind classification walls surfaced simultaneously across multiple networks, as if released by a single, coordinated breath. In Langley, analysts stared at their screens in disbelief. In Rome, bells rang without instruction. In New York, newsrooms scrambled as names no one had uttered publicly for decades suddenly dominated every feed. The truth did not knock. It arrived. Clara Whitmore sat on the cold stone floor of the Ravenscroft basement, her back against the chamber wall, heart racing. The voices were gone now, but their absence felt heavier than their presence had ever been. It spoke, she thought. It spoke, and the world heard it. Mark Ellison knelt beside her, breathing hard. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure it was true. "I feel like something passed through me," she said. "Like standing too close to a storm." Mark swallowed. Above them, footsteps moved cautiously. Federal agents regrouped, no longer barking orders, no longer confident. Some stared at their hands, as if seeing them for the first time. One agent whispered, "My father's name. It said my father's name." Another shook his head repeatedly. That wasn't possible. Mark rose to his feet, positioning himself between Clara and the others. "She's not your asset," he said firmly. No one argued, because no one knew what authority still meant. In a secured conference room beneath the Capitol, a man removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. "This was never supposed to reach civilian consciousness," he said. A woman across the table leaned forward. "With respect it already has." Screens around the room showed headlines updating faster than anyone could read. Sealed confessions leaked worldwide religious and government officials, implicated Ravenscroft files, confirmed authentic. A third voice spoke quietly from the shadows. "Phase 3 is approaching." The room went still. "That protocol was theoretical," someone snapped. "So was Ravenscroft," the voice replied. At St. Anselm's Cathedral, Father Thomas Keane watched crowds gather outside the gates. Some prayed, some shouted, some simply waited, unsure why they had come, but unable to stay away. Keane felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. We believed confession required a priest, he thought. We never imagined it could demand an audience. His phone buzzed again. This time, he answered. Yes, he said quietly. The voice on the other end spoke a single sentence. The house spoke. Now the question is whether the church will. Keane closed his eyes. Then tell them, he replied. I am ready. Back in Briar Hollow, Ravenscroft Manor stood dark and scarred against the night sky. Its windows were black, its walls silent. But silence did not mean emptiness. Clara felt it as she stood in the front hall, escorted loosely now, no longer restrained. The house was still listening, not broadcasting, listening. She turned to Mark. It's waiting, she said. For what? He asked. For a response. Outside, the crowd grew. Inside, somewhere deep within the structure, systems older than memory shifted. Phase 2 had ended. Phase 3 had begun. The first public statement came at 6:12 p.m. Eastern Time. It lasted 97 seconds, and it changed everything. A senior government official stood behind a podium, eyes rigid, voice rehearsed. We are aware of the recent dissemination of unauthorized materials allegedly connected to Ravenscroft Manor. An investigation is ongoing. We urge the public to remain calm and refrain from speculation. The broadcast cut. Silence followed. Then laughter, not mockery, recognition. Because the people had already heard too much. Screens across the world filled with side-by-side comparisons. Documents spoken by the walls of Ravenscroft matched archived files down to dates, signatures, and internal reference numbers. Truth didn't need validation anymore. It had alignment. In Briar Hollow, night fell slowly. Floodlights surrounded Ravenscroft Manor, but no one entered. Orders had come down. Do not disturb the structure. No one wanted to be responsible for triggering it again. Clara Whitmore stood behind the temporary barrier, wrapped in a borrowed coat. Her breath fogged in the cold air. Mark Ellison stood beside her, silent. You know, they'll never let this go, he said finally. They'll rebrand it, rename it, bury it again. Clara shook her head. They can't, she replied. Not this time. Her internal monologue steadied. You can't unhear truth. You can't unknow it. Across the street, people held phones aloft, recording, streaming, archiving. The house loomed behind them, quiet, waiting. In Rome, the lights inside a private chamber burned long past midnight. Cardinals argued, some wept, some prayed, some denied everything. Father Thomas Keane stood at the center, his voice calm, unyielding. We believed silence preserved faith, he said, but silence preserved power. And now, power has been exposed. A man across the table slammed his hand down. If we speak, we fracture the church. Keane met his gaze. If we don't, he replied, we prove the walls were right. At 3:04 a.m., the second message appeared. Not spoken, written. A text document uploaded simultaneously across dozens of mirrored sites. Its title chilled those who read it. Phase 3, open audit. It contained no accusations, no names, only a framework, instructions, a system, how to listen, how to verify, how to respond. Ravenscroft had not only confessed, it had taught the world how to do the same. Mark's phone buzzed. Clara leaned over his shoulder. A notification from a federal source he didn't recognize. You are requested to participate in oversight. Decline or accept. Mark laughed softly. They're asking permission now. Clara's phone buzzed at the same time. Her message was shorter. The structure has identified you as a necessary witness. Her chest tightened. Necessary, not optional. She looked back at the manor. For the first time, she felt something unexpected. Not fear, not dread, responsibility. They built a house to hide truth, she said quietly. It turned itself into a mirror. Mark nodded. And mirrors don't forget. As dawn crept over Briar Hollow, Ravenscroft Manor remained standing, silent. but awake. Across the world, institutions braced for reckoning because the voices had stopped speaking, and now they were waiting to hear what humanity would say next. 5 years later, Ravenscroft Manor no longer appeared on official maps. Satellite images blurred its coordinates. Navigation systems rerouted around it automatically. Government explanations varied. Environmental hazard, structural instability, historical preservation dispute. None of them were true. The truth was simpler. Ravenscroft was no longer a place, it was a boundary. Clara Whitmore stood on the observation deck overlooking the restricted perimeter, her identification badge catching the morning light. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and old stone. The house stood unchanged below, dark against the landscape, as if time itself had learned to avoid it. 5 years, she thought. 5 years since the world listened. She remembered the first weeks after Phase 3. The chaos. Governments collapsing under audits they could not control. Religious institutions fracturing as confession became public rather than private. Entire systems forced to confront the cost of silence. Ravenscroft had not accused, it had revealed process. And process was harder to deny. Inside the Global Oversight Facility, Mark Ellison adjusted the strap of his security vest. He had traded a sheriff's badge for something heavier, responsibility without borders. "You're late," he said as Clara joined him. She smiled faintly. The house was active. Mark's expression tightened. "Again?" "Not broadcasting," she said quickly. "Just listening." That word still unsettled him. Listening. They walked down a long corridor lined with glass panels. Behind them, analysts monitored feeds from sites across the world, former containment structures, sealed archives, forgotten vaults. Ravenscroft had inspired copies, some intentional, some accidental, most unstable. "They're still trying to replicate it," Mark said. "Every government wants a truth filter, and every institution wants a mute button," Clara replied. Her internal monologue surfaced. They learned the wrong lesson. You can't control truth. You can only face it. At 10:47 a.m., an alert pulsed through the facility. Unscheduled resonance. Site Alpha. Mark swore under his breath. That site was decommissioned. Clara stopped walking. "No," she said slowly. "It was buried." They reached the control room as analysts scrambled. "Audio bleed detected," one shouted. "Low level but coherent." Clara closed her eyes. She could feel it. Not voices. Intent. "The house taught others how to speak," she said. "But it also taught them when." Mark turned to her sharply. "You think this is coordinated?" She opened her eyes. "I think Ravenscroft was never the source." Silence fell. Across the world, people paused mid-motion. A familiar hum returned. Soft. Measured. Not from one location. From many. The voices did not accuse. They asked, "Will you listen now?" Clara felt the weight of it press into her chest. "This is bigger than Phase 3, Mark said quietly. She nodded. "This is the answer." Outside, Ravenscroft Manor stood unchanged, patient, unfinished. The question did not echo. It settled. Across continents, the low resonance faded into silence, leaving behind something far more unsettling than sound. Choice. Clara Whitmore stood perfectly still in the control room as feeds stabilized one by one. No alarms, no spikes, no chaos, just face suds of people sitting down, listening, not to walls, to themselves. "This isn't escalation," Mark Ellison said slowly, watching the global map dim to neutral tones. "It's convergence." Clara nodded. Her internal monologue was calm now, almost resigned. This was never about exposure. It was about responsibility. Truth doesn't destroy systems. Refusal does. She stepped toward the central display, where Ravenscroft Manor's silhouette pulsed softly. "For decades," she said, "they treated truth like a contaminant, something to be sealed, diluted, controlled." Mark crossed his arms. "And Ravenscroft? It was never a weapon," Clara replied. "It was a failsafe. The final revelation." The classified report, released 5 years later, would confirm what only a handful of people already knew. Ravenscroft Manor was not built to store voices. It was built to test silence. In 1891, a private consortium, funded jointly by government, religious authorities, and industrial power, commissioned a structure designed to measure how long a society could suppress truth before collapse. The walls were layered not just with stone, but with resonance chambers calibrated to human psychology, confession frequencies, stress harmonics, moral dissonance. Ravenscroft did not judge. It listened, and when the pressure reached a threshold, it responded, not with punishment, with memory. Phase 1 observed. Phase 2 released. Phase 3 asked the only question that mattered. What will you do now that you know? 10 years later, the exclusion zone still existed, but no fences remained. People came willingly, not to hear voices, to stand in silence. Clara returned once a year. She stood at the edge of the grounds, hands in her coat pockets, feeling the quiet weight of the place. The house remained unchanged. No decay, no restoration, no ownership. Mark joined her, older now, grey at the temples. They're teaching this in schools, he said quietly. Not the house, the moment. She smiled faintly. Good. It was never about architecture. A breeze moved through the trees. For a brief second, Clara thought she felt something familiar. Not a voice. Acknowledgement. The last choice. On the 10th anniversary of Phase 3, a global referendum was held, not mandated, invited. A single question appeared on screens worldwide. Should institutions retain the right to permanent secrecy? The result was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 68% voted no, not because they believed all truth was harmless, but because they understood silence had a cost. That night, Clara stood alone one final time before Ravenscroft Manor. She placed her hand against the stone, cold, still, complete. "Thank you," she whispered. The house did not respond. It didn't need to. Somewhere far beyond Briar Hollow, beyond governments, beyond faith and power, the world moved forward carrying something new. Not certainty, but courage. And that, Ravenscroft had proven, was the only thing silence could never contain. You've witnessed this mystery, but the real question remains. If walls could speak and truth asked to be heard, would you listen? If this story made you think, question, or feel uneasy, that's exactly why it needed to be told. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like this don't end when the video does. Sometimes they begin there.